My name is Wendell Boone. I am 76 years old, and 11 days ago, I stood in a county morgue and looked down at the face of a man I buried 16 years ago. I spent 22 years in the Navy Seabees, pouring concrete in places nobody wants to talk about anymore, and 26 years after that as a fire marshal for this county, reading burned buildings for a living. And there is very little left in this world that can put a shake in my hands. But at 4:40 in the morning on the 2nd of October, a detective called my landline and asked me to come down and identify a body pulled out of the Missouri River, because the man in the water was carrying a card in his wallet that read, "In case of anything, call my father, Wendell Boone." I told him he had the wrong house. I told him my younger son died in 2009, and that I carried the casket myself on the left rear handle in the rain. Before I tell you what was tattooed under that dead man's collarbone, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. And hit like and subscribe if you have ever been lied to by someone who carried your own last name. One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, greed, and quiet strength are very real. Now, let us begin. It was the first hard cold of the season, the kind that comes to Kansas City overnight and catches everybody with their storm windows still open. I dressed in the dark. Flannel shirt, canvas coat, the boots I have worn to 900 fire scenes, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a full minute with my hand flat on the mattress where Colleen used to sleep, the way I still do most mornings without meaning to. My wife has been gone 9 years. The house has been too quiet for 9 years. I took my oxygen cannula off because I am stubborn and because I did not want a detective seeing me hooked to a machine. And I drove down to the medical examiner's office on Cherry Street with the heater roaring and my chest already tight from the cold. I want you to understand who I was that morning, because it matters to everything that came after. I am not a man who believes in signs or ghosts or messages from beyond. I am a man who spent a quarter of a century crawling through the wet char of burned houses with a flashlight in my teeth. And if that trade teaches you anything, it teaches you that a fire will always tell you the truth about where it started. Concrete does not lie. Steel does not lie. Burn patterns do not lie. People lie constantly, and they lie best of all when they are crying. I had built my whole working life on the difference between those two things, and I still managed to miss the largest lie ever told to me, because it was told by my own child. And love makes a man read the evidence the way he wishes it read. There was one other thing I knew that morning, and I did not yet know that it mattered. Every Thursday evening for the last 3 years, I have gone to the Veterans Clinic on Linwood for a pulmonary appointment. And every Thursday I have sat in that long, empty hallway waiting for a nurse who runs 40 minutes behind. And every Thursday, the man who ran the floor buffer up that hallway stopped and shut the machine off and asked me how my week was, and then stood there and waited for the answer. His name tag said Dale. He was somewhere around 40, quiet, careful, with a burn scar on his right forearm that ran up under his sleeve. He knew I took my coffee from the machine black. He knew that the second Thursday of the month I came in worse than the others because that is the week I do my breathing test. He was, and I am ashamed of how true this is, the only person in the state of Missouri who asked me a question and then stayed to hear me answer it. The medical examiner's office is a low brick building the color of a wet sidewalk. Detective Ruben Ochoa met me at the door with 2 coffees he did not need to buy and the tired eyes of a man 3 hours past the end of his shift. He walked me down a hallway that smelled of floor wax and cold air and told me what he had. A man, mid-40s, pulled out of the river below the Chouteau Bridge at 10 minutes past 2 in the morning by a tow crew working a barge line. No boat, no car found, no identification besides the card. And then he opened the door of a room that was colder than the parking lot, and a technician folded back the sheet, and I put my hand out and caught the edge of the steel table. Because the man on it was Dale. I know what a body looks like after time in the water. I have seen more of them than I would choose. But there is a difference between a body and a face you know. And Dale's face was still his face, only gray and slack and wrong, with his hair pushed back off his forehead the way the current had left it. I heard myself say his name out loud. Ochoa asked me how I knew him, and I told him the truth, that he mopped the hallway at the Veterans Clinic, that we talked on Thursdays, that I did not know his last name, that I had never once seen him outside that building. And I remember thinking, with a strange, sick relief, that at least this was only a coincidence. A card in a wallet, some clerical mix-up, a stranger who had somehow written my name down. Then Ochoa asked the technician to lower the sheet another few inches because there was a mark on the body he wanted photographed in better light. And I looked down at the man's chest, and the room went out from under me. There, just below the right collarbone, in small, careful black ink, were 3 lines. Section 9, Row 4, Plot 11. Not a name, not a date, not a symbol. Just a location. The way you would write it on a work order. The way a man writes something he is afraid he will not be able to say out loud. In April of 1979, Colleen went into labor 8 weeks early, and our second child was born dead. We named him Micah because we had already picked it, and because Colleen said a name is a thing you give a person, not a thing you give a survivor. We had no money for a stone. We bought the cheapest plot the county cemetery would sell us, out past the maintenance shed where the ground slopes and nobody walks, and the groundskeeper wrote the location on a carbon slip and handed it to me, and I put it in my wallet. Section 9, Row 4, Plot 11. There is no marker there. There is no record with our name on it, because the burial was filed under the hospital's account. In 46 years, I have told exactly one living person those numbers, and she died in 2016. And I put her in the ground on the other side of town, because that is what she asked for. I stood in that cold room doing arithmetic that would not come out. Colleen knew, I knew, nobody else. Not my sister, not our pastor, not our older son who was 4 years old that spring, and who spent that whole week at his grandmother's house in Sedalia. There was no way on this earth for a night custodian at a veterans clinic to have those 3 numbers written on his body, unless somebody had given them to him. And the only person who could have given them to him had been dead for 9 years. I looked at that ink, and I understood, in the flat, mechanical way I used to understand a pour pattern on a scorched floor, that I was not looking at an accident. A man does not tattoo a burial plot on his chest by chance. He does it so that if he is ever found, somebody will know exactly who he is. It was not a coincidence. It was a signature. The heavy door banged open behind me, and my older son came in. Grant is 50 years old. He is a vice president at a company called Meridian Medical Reclamation. He wears $1,100 suits, and he has never in his life entered a room quietly. He came across that floor with both hands out and his face already breaking, and he said, "Oh God, Dad, I am so sorry. I am so sorry you had to see this." And he put his arms around me, and I stood there inside them like a fence post. I have watched real grief. I have knocked on doors at 3 in the morning and told women their husbands did not come out of a warehouse. Real grief is quiet and ugly, and it folds a person inward. Grant's grief was loud, and it was aimed, and every bit of it was pointed at Detective Ochoa, who was standing by the door with a clipboard. Then he gave me the story, and he gave it fast, which is the first thing that told me it was rehearsed. He said the dead man's name was Dale Merrick. He said Merrick was a man the company foundation had sponsored years ago through a work program, that he had fixated on our family, that he had shown up at Grant's office twice, that he had been calling and hanging up, that Grant had quietly been paying him a few $100s a month for 2 years just to keep him at a distance. He said he had never told me because he did not want to frighten me. He said, and I remember the exact phrasing because I have turned it over about 400 times since, "He was not well, Dad. He was obsessed with you. I have been handling it." And there it was, all wrapped up with a bow. A stranger, a sick man, a mystery already solved, presented to me by the only person who had any reason to want it solved. I did not argue with him. I said thank you. I said I was tired. And while he was talking to Ochoa about paperwork, I went and stood at the window that looks out on the staff parking lot, because I wanted a minute, and because old habits do not retire when you do. It had frosted hard overnight. Every windshield in that lot was white and blind with it. 7 cars, all of them furred over, except the black sedan parked closest to the door, which was clear as glass, with the last of the melt still beading and running down the hood. I have investigated enough vehicle fires to know exactly what a warm hood looks like at 5 in the morning. Grant told the detective he had driven in from Leawood the moment the call came, and the call had come at 4:50. Leawood to Cherry Street is 35 minutes at that hour. That car had been sitting in that lot with the engine running for a long time before anyone called anybody. He had not raced to a tragedy. He had been waiting on it. He came and found me at the window and put a hand between my shoulder blades and started talking about arrangements. He said the county would put a man like this in a plywood box in a field, and that we should not let that happen. He said he would pay for a cremation, that he would handle everything, that he had already called a funeral home, and they could take custody as soon as the medical examiner released the body, possibly tomorrow. Tomorrow. He said the word twice. He said the family did not need a scandal, that people would talk, that it was cleaner this way. And he used that word too. Cleaner. My son stood in a morgue 11 feet from a man with a burial plot inked on his chest, and pushed to have him burned to ash inside of 24 hours. And he called it kindness. So I did the only thing I could do, which was to become old in front of him. I let my shoulders go. I let my breathing go ragged, which took no acting at all, and I put my hand flat on the wall and asked if somebody could find me a chair and some water, because my chest was tightening. It worked exactly the way I knew it would. Grant is a man who has spent his whole life waiting for me to become a problem he could manage, and the moment I gave him that, he practically ran. He went one way for a nurse, and Ochoa went the other way for the water fountain, and I had the room and the intake desk to myself for about 90 seconds. On that desk was the preliminary report and the property log, and I have never in my life read anything faster. Most of it was what I expected. Adult male, no identification, recovered 2:10 in the morning. Cause of death listed as presumptive drowning, pending autopsy. But it was the property log that stopped me cold. Because a property log is just an honest list of objects, and it does not know it is lying. Boots, laced and double knotted. Jacket, zipped to the collar. Keys, right front pocket. Cell phone, left inside chest pocket. And one item. Wristwatch, steel, recovered from left wrist. I read that line 3 times. I had watched that man work for 3 years. He tied the strings of his apron with his left hand. He He wrote the date on the sign-in board with his left hand. He pushed that buffer with his left hand on the throttle and his right on the guide bar. Dale was left-handed, and a left-handed man wears his watch on his right wrist, and he had worn it on his right wrist every Thursday of the last 3 years. And I know that because I sat across from him while he checked the time and told me the nurse was still backed up. Somebody had dressed that man. Somebody had put his watch back on the wrong arm and zipped his coat to his throat and double-knotted his boots and put his keys and his phone in his pockets, because a man who walks into the Missouri River in October does not do it fully equipped for a shift. And whoever did it did not know him well enough to know which wrist. Which meant that every single word my son had said in that room was false. Because a man does not pay somebody $400 a month for 2 years and not know which hand he writes with. Grant had never met him. Grant had told me a story about a sick stranger, and the only way he could have known to tell me any story at all was if he already knew there was going to be a body. The property log had an address on it from a rent receipt in the man's back pocket, a rooming house on Bellefontaine in the East Bottoms, down where the streets still smell like the stockyards 100 years after the stockyards closed. I did not go home. I drove there with my hands at 10 and 2 and my heart going like a bad compressor. If Grant was moving fast enough to have a funeral home on the phone before sunrise, then somebody was going to be emptying that room before lunch. The building was 3 stories of soft brick with a fire escape I would have condemned on sight. The landlady was asleep, and the front door lock was a 5-pin tumbler from about 1960. I am not proud of what I did next, but I am not sorry either. It took me under a minute. The room was on the 2nd floor at the back, and it was the room of a man with nothing. A cot made tight, a hot plate, 2 shirts on wire hangers, a coffee can of bolts and washers, and on the long wall, floor to ceiling, every square inch of it, was me. Photographs of me leaving the Veterans Clinic, photographs of my truck in my own driveway, a hand-drawn map of my property with the porch light marked and the neighbor's dog marked and the times of the mail carrier written in the margin. A page torn from a notebook listing my prescriptions in 3 careful columns. My street, my routine, my life, taken apart and pinned up like a wiring diagram. I stood in the middle of that room with my flashlight shaking, and I thought, God help me. Grant was telling the truth. This man was sick. This man was hunting me. And then I read the margins, because I am an investigator, and because I have never in my life been able to leave a document half-read, and the whole world turned over. The notes were not threats. They were readings. Thursday the 11th. Dial set to 1.5 liters. Prescription is 3. Reset to 3. Monday the 22nd. Dial at 2. Reset to 3. 4th time since June. Housekeeper leaves at 4. Service company came Tuesday. Not scheduled. No work order left. New keypad on the side door. He does not know the code. He is short of breath crossing the yard. He is sleeping in the chair now. I want the maintenance log for the concentrator. I think somebody is inside the house. I own an oxygen concentrator. It sits in my front room, and it runs all night, and it is supposed to deliver 3 liters a minute. And I have spent the last 1.5 years wondering, in the quiet way a proud man wonders, whether I was finally going downhill. I sat down on the edge of that cot in a dead man's room, and I understood that I was being turned down, a little at a time. A dial moved from 3 to 1.5 after I fell asleep, and put back before I woke, over and over for a year, until an old man with bad lungs simply declined the way old men with bad lungs do. And this man, This stranger with a mop and a name tag had been coming into my house behind whoever was doing it and quietly setting the dial back where it belonged and writing it down and never once saying a word to me about it. I heard a vehicle door in the alley below, then a second one, then 2 sets of boots on the stairs, unhurried, the way men walk when they are being paid by the hour. I killed the flashlight. There was nothing in that room worth taking except whatever he had been afraid to leave in the open, and a man who is that careful with a wall does not leave his real work on a table. I went through the cot. Nothing. The coffee can. Bolts. And then I looked at the bed frame, and it was hollow steel tube with rubber feet on it. And I have spent my life around men who hide things in the hollow parts of ordinary objects. So I pulled the foot off the near leg, and a rolled notebook slid out into my hand. The footsteps stopped outside the door. I went out the window and down the fire escape with a notebook in my coat. 76 years old, wheezing like a bad furnace, and I did not stop until I was 3 blocks away and sitting in my truck with the doors locked. And I turned on the dome light and opened the cover. And on the flyleaf, in block capitals, in handwriting I had seen on 100 school papers stuck to a refrigerator with a magnet, it said, "Property of Nathan W. Boone. If I am found, give this to my father." I want to be careful about how I describe the next few minutes, because I do not think I have the words for them. My son Nathan was 26 years old when his car went off a county road east of Sibley in October of 2009 and burned. There was not much left. They identified him from dental records. I stood in a funeral home, and a director named Halvard Crane put his hand on my arm and told me, kindly, that I did not want to see. And I believed him. And we buried a closed casket on a Tuesday in the rain. And Colleen never got out of that black dress for 11 days. I carried the left rear handle. I put my hand on that box. And I sat in my truck on Bellefontaine 16 years later, holding a notebook that said my dead son had been mopping a hallway 20 feet from my chair every Thursday for 3 years. I did not go to the police with it. Not yet. A 76-year-old man on oxygen walking into a station house saying his son, who died in 2009, has turned up in the river, is a man who gets a chair, a cup of coffee, and a phone call to his next of kin. And his next of kin was the problem. So I went to see Ambrose Teague. Ambrose was the county medical examiner for 19 years, until he asked one too many questions about a jail death and found himself retired at 58. He runs a small private lab out of a converted machine shop near the river, and he still keeps his hands steady. I gave him a comb I had taken from the rooming house and a sealed envelope with hair of my own, and I asked him to tell me I was losing my mind. He called me back in 31 hours and asked me to come in and sit down before he said anything, which is how I knew. He put a single sheet on the table between us, and he did not soften it. The samples shared the markers of a first-degree relative, parent and child, 99.99%. The man in the drawer at the medical examiner's office was my son. Then he told me the second thing, the one he had gone looking for on his own, because he did not like the smell of the first one. He had called in a favor and gotten a look at the preliminary autopsy findings. There was river water in the man's stomach, and almost none in his lungs. There was no foam in the airway. There was bruising at the base of the skull and across both shoulder blades, consistent with a man being held down, and abrasions on both knees. Nathan did not drown in the Missouri River. Nathan was drowned somewhere shallow, in something like 8 inches of water. And then he was dressed and driven and put in the river to travel. I drove from Ambrose's shop to the county records annex on 12th Street, and I sat in a plastic chair in a fluorescent room and I requested the fire investigation file for the incident of October 11th, 2009. And I want you to understand what that request cost me, because it is the thing I will answer for when my time comes. In 2009, I was the fire marshal for this county. I was the man they sent when a scene did not make sense. And when it was my son's car in that ditch, I was recused, correctly, and the file went to a good man named Petrosky, who had 11 months until retirement, and he ruled it a single-vehicle accident with a post-crash fuel fire, and I signed nothing, and I read nothing. For 16 years, that folder sat in a box 4 miles from my house, and I never opened it, because I could not make myself look at a photograph of my boy's car. The one man in this county trained to read that fire was the one man who refused to stand close enough to look. I opened it at that table with a magnifier and my reading glasses, and I found 3 things in under 20 minutes. Any one of them would have opened an investigation if a stranger had brought it to me. The first was in the toxicology. No soot in the trachea. Carboxyhemoglobin saturation under 3%. A living man in a burning car breathes, and when he breathes, he takes in smoke and carbon monoxide, and his airway blackens, and his blood loads up, and it is the single most reliable thing in this entire trade. That man was dead before the fire touched him. The second was in Petrosky's own photographs, which he took correctly and then read wrong because he was tired and 11 months from a boat in Table Rock Lake. The burn was heaviest on the passenger seat and the passenger floor pan, with clean, irregular edges pooling down toward the door sill, and it moved from there. A fuel line fire starts forward and works back. An engine fire starts forward and works back. That fire started inside the cabin, on the seat, from something poured out of a container. The third thing was the one that put me on my feet in a public records room like a fool. The dental comparison chart, the document that gave a name to what was in that car, listed an amalgam restoration on the lower left second molar. Nathan did not have a lower left second molar. He lost it at 14 years old at the Line Creek rink when a boy named Petey Duran high-sticked him in the 3rd period, and I drove him to the emergency room myself with a towel full of ice and a tooth in a paper cup, and the oral surgeon told us there was not enough left to save. I paid that bill in 4 installments. The chart that identified my son had a tooth in it that had been gone for 12 years. And the dentist who certified that comparison, a man named Lyle Fenner, closed his practice 4 months later, surrendered his license voluntarily, and moved to Belize. So then I had to ask the question I had been circling for 2 days, which was who I had buried. It took me 1 afternoon and a librarian with a microfilm reader. In the second week of October 2009, a man named Errol Kinsey, 41 years old, walked out of a shelter on Troost where he had been staying for 9 months and never came back. His caseworker filed a missing person report. The report was closed 11 weeks later for lack of information. He had one living relative, a sister in Topeka, who called that police department 8 times in 2 years and then stopped calling. Nobody looked for Errol Kinsey, because nobody looks for a man like Errol Kinsey. And that is precisely why somebody chose him. He has been lying under a granite stone with my son's name on it for 16 years, in a plot I paid for, and every Memorial Day I have put flowers on him and talked to him like he was my boy. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my front room with the concentrator hissing beside me and the notebook on my knee, and I read the whole thing straight through, and by 4 in the morning, I understood the shape of the last 16 years. In 2009, Nathan was 26 and working nights in the sterile processing warehouse at Meridian Medical Reclamation, where his older brother had gotten him a job as a favor he never let anybody forget. Meridian's business is reprocessing. You take single-use surgical devices, you clean them, you certify them, you sell them back to hospitals at a discount. It is legal and it is heavily regulated, and there is a great deal of money in doing it badly. Nathan wrote down what he saw on that night shift for 5 months. Devices being run past their validated cycle counts, lot numbers being reprinted, catheters and staplers going out on trucks labeled as new that had been through a patient and a wash bay. He had photographs. He had a folder. He told Grant he was taking it to the federal government on Monday. They took him out on a county road on Friday. And here is where my son, my older son, the one still breathing, showed the exact quality of mind that has made him a wealthy man. He did not kill Nathan. He explained something to him instead. He had already made the arrangement with Halvard Crane, the funeral director, a man who could produce a body and paperwork for a price. He told Nathan that in about 40 minutes a car was going to burn on that road with a man in it, and that the man was going to be identified as Nathan Boone, and that this was going to happen whether Nathan agreed or not. And then he offered him the terms. $50,000 in cash. Leave the state. Never contact your father. Never contact your mother. If you ever surface, if you ever mail a letter, if you ever pick up a telephone, I will kill her first, and I will make sure you know it was you who did it. Nathan was 26 years old, and he believed him. And I have read his own account of that night in his own handwriting, and I will tell you that he was right to believe him. He took the money. He got in a truck going west, and he let his mother and his father bury a stranger with his name on it, because he decided that his mother alive and grieving was better than his mother dead. He wrote that sentence 4 times in that notebook across 16 years, in 4 different pens, like a man checking a load-bearing wall. Then Colleen died in 2016 of a stroke on a Sunday afternoon, and the only thing holding Nathan in the dark went into the ground with her. And it took him 6 more years to work up the nerve to come home to a city where he was legally dead and where his own father had signed the identification. He could not knock on my door. Think about it the way he had to. He had no identification. He had been declared dead by the county at a hearing his father attended. His fingerprints, if anyone ran them, belonged to a man in a grave. The one living person who could confirm his story was the man who had put him in that grave. And so he did the only thing left. He got a job under a dead man's name at the one building he knew for a fact I would walk into every single Thursday. And he pushed a floor buffer past me for 3 years, and he collected everything he could carry, and he waited to be certain that when he finally spoke, I would be able to prove he was not a lunatic. I went to see Renata next, because in every one of these things there is a person standing just inside the door who did not build the house, but has been living in it. My daughter-in-law is 46. She met me at a diner off Bannister Road, and she sat down with her sunglasses on and her hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from. I did not shout at her. I put 3 things on the table in front of her, in order. A copy of a guardianship petition filed in Jackson County 11 days before Nathan came out of the river, naming her as a co-petitioner, alleging that I was suffering from progressive cognitive decline and could no longer manage my affairs, with a physician's affidavit attached. A printout showing that 4 months earlier, every asset she thought she jointly owned had been quietly moved into an entity where her name does not appear. And Ambrose Teague's single sheet of paper with the words parent and child on it. She looked at the 3rd one for a long time. Then she took the sunglasses off and told me the rest. And most of it she told me before I asked. She said a man had come to their house in July, standing at the gate at the end of the driveway, not coming in, just standing there. She said Grant went out and talked to him for 20 minutes, and came back inside gray in the face and told her it was a con artist working an old family angle and to call the police if he ever came back. She said that after that, Grant stopped sleeping. She said he took calls in the garage. She said that on the last night of September, he left the house at 10 in the evening, saying there was an alarm at the Liberty warehouse, and came home at 2 in the morning, and that his boots and both trouser legs were soaked to the knee, and that he put them in the burn barrel at the back of the property and stood out there in the cold with a lighter, and that in 11 years of marriage, she had never once seen that man burn anything himself. There is a shallow gravel landing on a creek that feeds into the river out past the Liberty Industrial Park, 8 inches of water over hard bottom, and it is a 9-minute drive from that warehouse. I gave every bit of that to Detective Ochoa, and to his credit, he did not put a hand on my shoulder and tell me to go home. He listened for 2 hours. But he told me the truth at the end of it, which is that he had a drowning, a dead man with no legal existence, a forged dental chart signed by a man in Belize, a wife who would be picked apart on the stand as a woman losing a divorce, and a suspect with 4 attorneys. He said he could arrest Grant on the fraud. He said he would very likely lose him on the murder. And I told the detective that I did not want an arrest. I wanted the man to hand me the whole thing himself. So I built the trap out of the only material I had, which was the one fact Grant could not survive and could not ignore. On a Monday morning, I filed a petition with the county to exhume the remains buried under the name Nathan William Boone on the grounds of a contested identification, and I made sure it was set for 8 in the morning on Friday. Then I made sure my son found out. I called his office and left a message with his assistant, in a voice I made sure sounded confused and upset, saying that I was digging Nathan up on Friday and that I had already spoken to a lawyer and to a reporter at the Star. Because the moment that casket comes open, Errol Kinsey's skeleton has a lower left second molar, and 16 years of architecture falls in on itself. Grant's own guardianship hearing was set for the following Tuesday. He needed me to be legally incompetent, and he needed it 4 days sooner than the calendar was going to give it to him. Then I gave him the door. On Wednesday evening, I went into the Veterans Hospital with a pulmonary crisis, and it was not entirely theater, because a man my age who has been running on 1.5 liters for a year does not have to work very hard to look like he is failing. Ochoa put me in a private room on the 4th floor at the end of a quiet hall. He had 2 officers in the linen room and a 3rd at the nurse station, and a camera in the smoke detector, and a technician who spent 40 minutes doing the one thing that mattered, which was disconnecting the wall oxygen from my mask and running a line from a bottle taped under the bed frame so that the gauge on the wall would read exactly what it was supposed to read and control absolutely nothing. Then everybody left, and the hall went dark, and I lay there in the green light of a monitor, waiting for my child to come and finish what he started in July. He came at 20 minutes past 1 in the morning. I heard the door ease open, and I heard him stand there, and then I heard the softest sound in the world, which was my son crossing a hospital room in good shoes. He did not have a weapon. He did not need one. He walked to the head of the bed, and he reached up, and he turned the wall regulator down until the little ball dropped to the bottom of the tube and sat there. And then he pulled the visitor chair around and sat down in it and crossed his legs and waited. That is what my son is. He is not a man who does violence. He is a man who adjusts a setting and then sits down comfortably to watch the arithmetic finish. And because he is who he is, he talked. He had a whole hospital room and a father he believed was suffocating, and nobody to perform for. And he still could not keep his mouth shut, and every word of it went onto a hard drive in the linen room down the hall. He said, "You should have left it alone. You always have to open the box. He told me about the road in 2009. He told me he had offered Nathan a fair deal and that Nathan took the money. And he said, "He chose $50,000 over you, Dad, so do not lie there thinking you lost a saint." He told me about Errol Kinsey, and he could not remember the name. He called him the man from the shelter. He said that Crane had bled him for 16 years, $31,000 a year, and that he was into 2 lenders, and that there was a federal audit coming at Meridian in November. He said Nathan had stood in the clinic parking lot on the last night of September and told him he was going to knock on my door on Sunday. Then he said the thing I will carry to the end. He said, "I held him down in 6 inches of water, and it took less time than you would think. And then I drove home, and I slept 8 hours." And then he leaned forward in that chair, and he said, quietly, almost tenderly, "I carried that casket too, Dad, right behind you. And you never once turned around." And I opened my eyes and I said, "I am turning around now." I would like to tell you that I got out of that bed and did something worthy of a picture. I did not. I am 76 years old, and I lay right where I was, and the overhead lights came on all at once, and the room filled with officers, and Ruben Ochoa read my son his rights while Grant sat in that visitor chair with his hands on his knees, looking at the wall regulator like it had betrayed him. He did not fight. He said the word attorney twice, and when they walked him out through the 4th-floor corridor at 1:30 in the morning, the night crew was standing in the hall, because word travels through a hospital faster than through any newsroom in America. And every one of those men and women in gray uniforms had known Dale. They had eaten lunch with him at 2 in the morning. They stood along that wall in silence and watched my son go by in handcuffs. And I have never in my life seen a man's face come apart the way his did under the eyes of people he had never once bothered to look at. I did not shoot him. People ask me that, and I understand why. I had a service weapon in the house, and a clean reason, and a jury in this state that might have understood. But a bullet is 4 seconds, and then it is over, and it lets a man like Grant become a story about a father who snapped. And I was not going to hand him that. I wanted him to have exactly what he had built: a long life in a small room, with a door controlled by somebody else, and every single thing he ever bought sold at auction, and his name on a docket, and 40 years to think about the fact that his brother had a plan for him. And the plan was mercy. They opened the grave on Friday morning at 8 o'clock, on schedule, in a cold drizzle, with a deputy medical examiner present and a county attorney taking notes. The man in that casket had a lower left second molar with an amalgam filling. 9 days later, he had his name back, and Errol Kinsey's sister drove in from Topeka in a 15-year-old Corolla and buried her brother in a churchyard outside Topeka with a stone that has his birthday on it, which is a thing she had stopped believing would ever happen. She wrote me a letter. I keep it in the drawer with Colleen's letters. She wanted me to know that she had never stopped calling, and I wanted her to know that somebody had finally answered. And then, on a Sunday afternoon when the house was quiet, I sat down and read the last page of Nathan's notebook, which I had been carrying around unread for 11 days, because I am a coward about exactly one thing. It was dated the 24th of September, 6 days before he died. It said, Thursday. Dial was at 1.5 again. Set it back to 3. He did not look up when I went past. He never looks up when I run the buffer, and that is all right. It is not his job to. I have decided I am not going to tell him. He buried me once. A man should only have to do that one time in his life. If I tell him, then he has to know what Grant is, and he has to know what I took to stay alive. And he would have to carry both of those things, at 76 with those lungs. Let him keep the son he buried. That one was better than me anyway. I will keep the dial at 3, and I will keep the notebook in case I am wrong. And that is enough. It is enough to stand in that hallway on Thursdays and hear him cough and know he is still here. He was not coming back for the company. He was not coming back for the money, or for the record, or even for justice. And he was not coming back for me. He had decided, in a rooming house with 2 shirts and a hot plate, that he would spend the rest of his life inside 11 feet of his father without ever once saying his own name, because he thought the truth would be heavier for me than the grief was. My son was killed for a claim he had already given up. Grant strangled the life out of a man in 6 inches of creek water to protect an inheritance and a company from a brother who had privately decided, in writing, to stay dead. Everything that has happened to this family in the last 16 years happened because one of my children could not conceive of a person who did not want what he wanted. 1 year later, the arithmetic is finished. Grant took a plea rather than let Renata testify, and he is serving life without parole at Jefferson City. And I have not written to him, and I do not intend to. Halvard Crane was charged with abandonment of a corpse, forgery, and conspiracy, and his funeral home is a vape shop now. Lyle Fenner was extradited from Belize in March, which surprised everybody, including Lyle Fenner. The federal audit at Meridian Medical Reclamation turned into an indictment and a recall notice that went out to 206 hospitals, and the company no longer exists. Renata lives in Springfield and manages a garden center and calls me on Sunday evenings, and she is doing better than she thinks she is. I sold the house in the spring because I was never going to sleep well in a room where somebody had been coming in at night to turn a dial, and I bought a small place on 1 floor with a good porch. I buried my son in April, out past the maintenance shed at the county cemetery, where the ground slopes and nobody walks, in Section 9, Row 4, in the plot right next to the one he had inked on his chest. And I bought 2 stones, because I had never bought the first one. One of them says Micah Boone, April of 1979, and it is the only marker that baby has ever had in 46 years. The other one says Nathan William Boone, and under the dates it says, because I could not think of anything truer, he came back and stood in the hallway. Every Thursday evening, I still drive to that veterans clinic, and I still sit in that long hallway in the same chair, and the new custodian is a young woman named Priya, who shuts the buffer off and asks me how my week was, and I make absolutely certain that I stay and answer her. This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man. But the lesson under it is as real as cold water and old bone. I spent 26 years telling people that a fire will always show you where it started, if you are willing to stand close enough to look. It turned out I was the one man I never applied it to. There was a folder in a box 4 miles from my house for 16 years with the whole truth sitting in it, and it was not hidden and it was not sealed. And the only thing standing between me and my son was that I did not want to see a photograph. Grief is not the same thing as love. Grief will let you keep a comfortable story, and love will make you open the file. So look at the thing you have been refusing to look at, and check on the quiet person who asks how your week is going. And if a man tells you he has been handling something on your behalf, ask him exactly how long he has been handling it. My name is Wendell Boone, and they buried the wrong man.